A young guy naturally seeks to learn his own value in life. When I was 15, I found out that I was worth $1.40 an hour. I took a summer job in a peach orchard working 10 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week. That orchard was on the edge of the Shenandoah National Park that had been created a few decades earlier by forcibly evicting all the mountaineers who lived on the land that the feds coveted for the park. The orchard was far back up Harmony Hollow, a hard luck stretch that earned its name because of all the rednecks shooting each other. Harmony Hollow was a few miles down the road from a Virginia locale formerly known as Helltown because of its endless brawling and body counts. The Scotch-Irish get no respect. The foreman at that orchard, Bobby Barfield, was a retired 20-year Army drill sergeant. He was always smoking Marlboros and always gasping for breath. Barfield had a blotchy face, sagging jaws, and a scowl that could peel paint. He was surly except when he was enraged. He never explained how to do a task since he preferred cussing you up and down afterwards for doing it wrong. He always talked like he had a half dozen peach pits jammed into his mouth, and if you asked him to repeat himself, he exploded at you as if you called his mother a shameless hussy. "What the hell's wrong with you, Red?" quickly became his refrain that summer. Melvin Kornheiser, the orchard manager, had skin that was undaunted by 1,000 sunburns, but his voice always squealed as if his underwear was 3 sizes too small. He lived in perpetual fear that the orthodontist who had bought the orchard would evict him at any moment. Melvin had a tall and busty teenage daughter who looked like she just stepped out of a traveling salesman joke. She was hailed as a prodigy in Harmony Hollow because she passed the written part of the driver's license exam the first time she took the test. No one who worked in that orchard, including myself, was ever voted most likely to succeed. There was Mr. Frame, a wiry old man with a toothless grin and hair slicked straight back like a 1930s Brill Cream ad. He lived way up the hollow, and you could tell he was coming to work because his car engine hadn't been tuned up since President Kennedy was assassinated. His old Chevy emitted a cloud of smoke that looked like an oil tanker hit by a torpedo. There was George, a stocky high school football player who boasted of having poison ivy all over his body as if he'd won the Heisman Trophy. If George had the money, he would have taken out a full-page newspaper ad announcing that he got the rash while boinking his girlfriend in the woods. George boasted about never using contraceptives during his joust. He seemed like the type who would play Russian roulette with a revolver with a bullet in every chamber. Another guy in that peach-picking crew planted seeds of doubt that would sprout and darken my horizon many years later. I was practically weaned on Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, a book that my father, a Boy Scout master, touted as practically the sum of earthly wisdom. No matter what your problem, no matter how hard life had become, thinking positive would damn near fix everything. Back in that era, people were encouraged to see cynicism as a toxic indulgence that was almost guaranteed to blight every waking hour. But Albert, a gaunt, dark-haired 35-year-old guy, shattered that stereotype. When Albert heard about anything that had happened, his response consisted almost entirely of 2 phrases: "That really burns my ass," or "no shit." He spoke of the pints of cheap booze he received for working overtime on a previous road-building job with the same rapture a young lady displays when catching a bridal bouquet. He'd seen plenty of hard times, and sometimes he lost his battles with the bottle. But Albert showed me the power of positive cynicism. He recognized much of the bullshit around him and in the nation. Heck, Nixon was president back then. But cheerfulness was still his default, and he could laugh more heartily than that Army drill sergeant ever did. I saw positive cynicism as an antidote to all the people who were always ragging on me about my bad attitude. There's an old saying that the start of wisdom is to learn what you don't know. That peach picking job came with a few revelations, or at least a few mysteries. One day, Melvin's brother Leroy came by the orchard to sample a few peaches and asked me the big question, "So, Jimmy, have you gotten any poontang yet?" I didn't know what poontang was. It sounded a little bit like possum, something I never encountered on a dinner table. This is back when roadkill cookbooks were all the rage. I figured Leroy might be asking me a trick question. I wanted to signal that I was open-minded on the topic. I said I didn't think I'd had any poontang yet, but I wasn't sure. No wonder the other guys howled at my response. Melvin would occasionally show up at lunch and wail, "I just can't bear to think of Dr. Van Dusen losing any more money on this orchard." And why was the good doc taking a loss? Because of the scandalously high wages given to loafers like us. Melvin and his old buddy Bobby would recite how back in the 1920s, they toiled in this orchard for $1 a day and worked a lot harder than we did. Looking at how things turned out for Melvin and Bobby, I saw no good reason to bust my tail on that job. A quarter century before I sweated in those groves, German prisoners of war plucked those peaches. Those soldiers probably appreciate having a better fate than getting blown to pieces on the Eastern Front. Many POWs gained weight in captivity in America. My pay rate in 1971 was barely more in inflation-adjusted terms than what the orchard had paid for those POWs in 1945. But at least I was entitled to all the peach fuzz I could take home on my neck and arm. Plus, there was no entertainment fee for encountering black snakes high up in peach trees while a metal bucket with 15 pounds of peaches swayed around my neck. I took that job practically as a last resort because federal regulations banned 15-year-olds from the vast majority of paid employment. The real purpose of those prohibitions was to minimize teenage competition for adult wage earners. There was an exemption in the child labor laws for agriculture work, even though farm work is among the most hazardous occupations. A few years later, the orchard manager was crushed to death when his tractor flipped over after hitting a groundhog hole. I worked at that orchard a second summer and then found better paying and less damned work. Barfield was the first in a series of bosses that spurred my lifetime devotion to self-employment. Another legacy of that orchard gig was the blue and white striped cap that I started wearing then and have kept up to this day. Those hats were cheap, comfortable, and all cotton. They weren't uncommon in the Appalachian Mountains, but north of the Mason-Dixon line, they sometimes evoked the same shock later produced by burkas. Little kids would tug on their mother's skirt, point at me, and ask if I was a train engineer. No, just a country boy trying to keep the sun off the top of his head. Gnats swarmed in that peach orchard, and cigars became my favorite bug repellent. Making smoke screens was good preparation for my future work as a Washington journalist. I kept smoking after leaving the orchard because my head needed every kickstart it could get. Actually, cheap cigars became a mainstay of my frugal lifestyle. For every day that I smoked cigars instead of doing cocaine, I saved $500. But the biggest takeaway from that job was philosophical. Late in the last century, it was fashionable for righteous kids to wear wristbands engraved with WWJD, "What Would Jesus Do?" A cousin of mine wore one of those bands but gave it up when he went to law school. I had a better fix. In the decades after toiling in that orchard, when I heard about some outrage by politicians or government, I would ask myself, what would my old peach-picking buddy Albert say? No shit.